My parents kicked me out of the house on the day of my final exams after my sister announced her pregnancy. Now a year later, they are both trying to contact me to sort things out about a year ago. Shortly after I turned 18, my parents decided that I could no longer stay home. Not only that, but it also coincided with the time of my final exams in high school, leaving me with nowhere to go. Luckily, I had good friends, especially my best friend and her parents who offered me their home. I am immensely grateful for their support. The reason my parents kicked me out was because my older sister announced her pregnancy. They felt it was the right time for her to move back in with them, so she could receive better care. My sister is not biological, but my half-sister. My mother was dating Jacob, my stepfather, for college, and she got pregnant a few months before they both graduated. At my age, she decided to have the baby without marrying Jacob, as their relationship was just a fling. Then they broke up. However, Jacob wanted to be a father, so they decided to raise Sasha, my half-sister, together. When Sasha was 3, my mother met my biological father. They dated for 2 years and got married a year later. She got pregnant with me. And again, she decided to go ahead with the pregnancy. My father was not ready to be a father and wanted to terminate the pregnancy, but my mother did not agree. This led to their separation, and my father abandoned my mother while she was pregnant. She decided to cut all ties with him and his family, reconciling again with Jacob. So when I was born, my father was no longer a part of my life, and I was raised by my mother and my stepfather. My parents got married a couple of years after my mother finalized her divorce from my father, but I could never accept my stepfather as part of my family. Since he never treated me as such, I think my mother decided to reconcile with him while she was pregnant with me to maintain family stability. But I always felt like a burden to him, and he was always cold to me since I was little. Even Sasha behaved the same way with me despite having been with my family all my life. I never managed to feel part of it. My parents always treated me like someone outside, and although my mother always claimed that she loved me as much as them, I never felt that affection due to the distance they kept when I was younger. I tried to get closer to them, but I was always rejected over time. I realized that I would never have a close relationship with Jacob and Sasha, and that is why I decided to give up trying to improve. Things didn't surprise me when they decided to kick me out of the house to accommodate Sasha, who was pregnant and wanted to come back. I knew that for Jacob, Sasha would always be a priority, no matter the age difference between us. However, I expected my mother to defend my position, which she didn't do a year ago, just 2 days ago. Just before final exam week started, Sasha announced her pregnancy. I was 24 at the time, and my parents decided that I should leave home to save money and accommodate Sasha and her boyfriend, who lived with her in a small apartment nearby. Sasha decided to come back home because she didn't feel comfortable living alone in the apartment. She works from home and her boyfriend has to go out to work every day. Plus, his job sometimes requires him to travel. They thought that during her pregnancy, it would be easier for her to come back to live with my parents. Parents avoiding being alone and saving on rent. Although I initially thought it was reasonable for Sasha to continue living there, my parents informed me that I should move for a few months to make room for her. Sasha already had a room in our house, but after she went to college and turned it into an office, my parents told me that I could not stay in the living room, and that the only viable option was to leave my room, asking me to see it as a sacrifice for the family. This change occurred just before my final exams, which increased my stress. Despite the pressure, I decided to stand my ground and told them that I would not leave since Sasha was never part of my family and did not deserve me to sacrifice my stability for her. My parents tried to reason with me, but I considered that they were acting irrationally and continued arguing until they finally stopped. Jacob informed me that I had to leave before the weekend since being an adult. He had the right to decide if he allowed me to stay in his house or not. I expected my mother to defend me, but she told me that Jacob was right and that they needed space for their real grandchildren. They did not have the time or energy to fight about this and simply mind. I had to fulfill what my mother told me. She used the expression, true grandchildren, which confirmed my suspicions of years about the small family group that she formed, Sasha and Jacob. And as I had always felt like a stranger to them, very affected by the situation, I decided to start packing immediately without worrying about the exam. The next day, my parents did not even try to stop me from leaving, which made clear what their priorities were. I ended up at my best friend's house, where I explained everything to her and her parents, who offered me to stay with them for as long as I needed. Many will wonder why I did not approach other members of the family, but I must clarify that I really do not have family. I know Jacob's family as well as they do, not like him and AB. I knew that going to them, it would be useless, since the last thing they would do would be to help me. As for my mother's family, I never knew my grandparents. Apparently, when my mother got pregnant with Sasa, her parents and the rest of our family cut her off completely. They wanted her to concentrate on getting her college degree, but she didn't really manage to graduate. I wish she wouldn't continue with the pregnancy because she was too young, but she decided to go ahead anyway. Since then, no one from her family has ever spoken to her again. They didn't even attend her with my father, or were there when Sasa and I were born. At least, that's what she told me. I thought I had no family that could help me, so I had to turn to my friends after being kicked out of home. I stayed with my best friend and her family, always hoping that my mother would look for me. Even though I had no expectations about Jacob Sasa, I knew that they never really cared about me, and they were probably glad that I was gone, since I never fit into their perfect little family. What really hurt me was that not even my mother tried to contact me after I left. After a few months, I lost all hope. It's been a year since then. Recently, some friends told me that Sasha gave birth a few months ago, and that she and her boyfriend have been posting on social media that they are proud parents of their daughter. The three of them still live with my parents, presumably to save on rent. I didn't care at all. I had honestly only focused on improving my own life after graduating high school. I had to come up with ways to get through college, since I no longer had contact with my parents or money. My best friend's parents were kind enough to let me live with them, rent-free. But I couldn't wait for them to help me financially. I managed to get into college thanks to a scholarship I got from one of the institutions I applied to. It wasn't my first or second choice, but I couldn't pass up any opportunity to save money. 60% of my tuition was covered by the scholarship, so I decided to apply for a student loan with the help of my friend's parents, who were guarantors of the loan. Let's make sure they have to worry about paying everything, since I was going to work as well as study. I have been paying everything on my own. It has been difficult, but I know that in the end I will make it, and it is also quite gratifying. During the last year, I had no contact with my family, and I did not expect them to do so. However, about a week ago, my mother sent me an email inviting me to spend the weekend at home because she really missed me, as did Jacob. And Sasa said they knew that he had been treated unfairly and wanted a chance to reconcile. My mother was very kind, and yet I felt like she was lying. Something didn't add up. A hunch or instinct told me that something fishy was going on. So I didn't respond to the email. For a couple of days later, she sent me another email, but I didn't respond either, despite the temptation, because I really wanted to know what was going on. I was sure there was a reason behind that behavior, as it was very unlikely that it had happened suddenly. Maybe a year after the incident, they had had a change of consciousness and felt guilty, which seemed possible. But I had known them all my life and knew what they were like, so I didn't fully believe it. Recently, my maternal grandparents decided to contact me. I was surprised that they had found a way to contact me already. I'm sure my parents didn't give them my contact information, but they said yes, so I asked a lot. Finally, one of my friends from high school decided to trust them and gave them my phone number. She turned out to be my best friend, and I'm glad she didn't say anything to me about it, because it was a nice surprise when they called me. I had a hard time believing it was really them, since I had never met them, or I had never seen them, or heard their voices. At first I was quite skeptical, but then they called me on FaceTime and showed me several photo albums with my mother, including photos from her childhood and teens. I finally believed them and knew that they were really my grandparents. They were very excited to see me, and so was I, although I didn't understand why. But I decided to move on. We started talking, and I told them about myself and my life. I tried to avoid the subject of my parents as much as I could, but it was pointless, because they already knew everything they had told me. Most of the reason why they hadn't contacted me until now was because of my parents, and they had recently found out the truth. That's why they decided to reach out. I was really confused about what that meant, because as far as I knew, my grandparents had excluded my mother from their lives. and they had never been in contact with her after her first pregnancy. That was all I knew since my mother had told me. But apparently, there was more to the story. The reason they had not spoken for so many years was not because they opposed my mother's pregnancy at such a young age, but because they did not approve of her relationship with Jacob. My mother had lied to me a lot about her own parents to preserve the impeccable image of Jacob. My grandparents had been very understanding of the pregnancy and had told her that it was her decision whether she wanted to have the baby or not. However, they did not agree with her relationship with Jacob, because he at that time was not an exemplary person. Jacob was an addict, quite well known. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, attended the same high school, and finished the same university. My grandparents were aware of what Jacob had been doing since high school and did not approve her relationship with my mother. They had given her an ultimatum. They were willing to support her throughout the pregnancy and afterwards, as she would obviously need financial support. But their only condition was that she had to break up with Jacob because they did not want him to influence her negatively. After much thought, my mother decided to separate from Jacob despite her efforts. She simply could not change her behavior, and I believe that it was the best for her. However, this created resentment towards Jacob. When Sasha was born, they managed to get full custody, while Jacob only had visitation rights, which increased gradually. Although Jacob was able to finish his degree and stay sober, my grandparents never fully came to trust him, and they were right, as he relapsed every 2 months, which was not beneficial for my mother or for Sasha. Because of this, they put my mother with my father, he turned out to be the son of a family friend. After seeing each other on and off for a couple of years, my mother married him as she had given up hope that Jacob would get better. However, she could never really leave him, because a year after her marriage, she got back with Jacob, and they started an affair later on. My mother got pregnant for the second time, and had to confess to my father the infidelity, as she simply could not imagine a life without Jacob being pregnant. She had to face the truth, and accept that her infidelity was the reason she divorced my father. I eventually married Jacob. Everything my mother had told me about my father, who was opposed to the idea of having me, turned out to be a big lie. After I was born, they ran several paternity tests, and luckily I found out that I had nothing to do with Jacob at all. I was actually my real father's biological daughter, which relieved me since I didn't want to be Jacob's biological daughter anyway. My biological father even had partial custody of me for a while, although I barely remember it since it was a long time ago. My biological father passed away in a car accident when I was 7 months old, which made it even easier for my mother to lie to me for the rest of my life. My father's family didn't want anything to do with me after his death, which benefited my mother and my grandparents. My grandparents were very angry to find out my mother had had an affair with Jacob. They gave her an ultimatum: either leave him forever and try to improve her marriage with my father, or get divorced and never contact them again. This time, my mother chose to stay with Jacob, since he had been almost a year clean. Longer than in any other previous period was the last major conflict my mother had with her parents. She was pregnant with me at the time, and they did not communicate until I was born, when my grandparents softened their stance and decided to get closer to meet me. However, Jacob was not ready to form a happy family with my grandparents due to the treatment he had received previously, so my mother also rejected his attempts at reconciliation. My grandparents did not give up and continued to try to talk to my mother every few months, but she never brought him back into her life. This persisted for a couple of years when Jacob and my mother went through financial difficulties and could not pay the rent without help. My mother had to contact her parents, who decided to buy her a house so she would not have to worry about rent anymore. My grandparents thought that this grand gesture might get her to talk to them again and maybe form a happy family, but that did not happen. Almost 6 years ago, my family and I moved into our new house, a considerable improvement from the previous apartment. I always wondered how my parents could afford a house like that, since it seemed quite expensive and it was in a nice neighborhood. My mother works as a receptionist and Jacob is in sales, but, as I mentioned, their company was going through a rough patch, and it was unlikely they could afford a house of that cost on their own. I now know it was all thanks to my grandparents. My parents are ungrateful people who still complain about it. I did not try to rebuild their relationship with my grandparents. Both my mother and Jacob knew they had paid for the house. However, my mother told my grandparents that they were not ready to reconnect yet, and that they needed time and space to think as they had not spoken in a long time. And emotionally, they found it difficult to deal with so many things at once. My grandparents, being quite understanding, gave them a few months, but when my mother did not communicate, they tried to talk again, and she asked for more space. This continued over the next few years until my grandparents accepted that maybe it was not meant to be. They were also getting older and told me that it was humiliating to try to contact their own daughter repeatedly, only to be rejected each time they finally told my mother that they understood that she wanted nothing to do with them, and that it was her own fault for not having been nice in the past. All they asked was that she send them pictures of our family so they would know that we were okay, and that was it. They had to go ahead, and surprisingly, my mother agreed. That was how my grandparents handled the situation in the latter years, which was very sad for me. I ended up crying when they told me all this, since all my life I had thought that they were the villains, but it was not like that. As to how they found out the truth, my grandfather recently had a health problem and had to face heart problems at that time. He and my grandmother decided that they could no longer pretend that everything was okay, as it was no longer. They were young. They wanted to fight against the circumstances, so that at least before they died, they would have the satisfaction of knowing that they did everything possible to reconcile with their family. So a few weeks ago, they decided to visit my mother's house unexpectedly. Technically, it was their house, since they paid for it, and it was in my mother's name when they visited her. My mother had no choice but to leave it. It entertained everyone. Suddenly, they discovered that they were now great-grandparents because Sasha had had her children. However, when they asked about me, my parents became very uncomfortable and did not know what to say. They decided to tell them that I was at university, and that it was probably not a good time to contact me because I was in a very fragile state due to exams and other things. They could not even make up a fake university name for my grandparents, which made them start to suspect that something strange was going on. It was happening. They got the feeling that my parents had made some mistake, and I decided to talk to our neighbors after they left the house. That is how they found out that I had not been living with my parents for the past a year after being kicked out. For some reason, my neighbors did not know the exact reason, but they had a son who went to school with me, and they told my grandparents that I had stayed with my best friend for a while, so my grandparents contacted my best friend, and they finally found out what had happened to me when they found out the truth. Naturally, they got angry. They told my mother that she needed to vac the house with her family to make room for the only real grandchild they had. I must say it was a perfect retribution, since those were exactly the words my parents had said to me. And my best friend. She made sure that my grandparents knew exactly what they were. Suddenly, everything made sense. My parents were trying to reach out to me and make things right because they were about to lose their house. The only reason my grandparents waited a couple of days to contact me, even after finding out everything, was because they were afraid of how I would react. But they finally decided to do it because they had wasted so many years out of fear of how my mother would react. And now they wanted to do the right thing, no matter how she reacted. My grandparents also wanted me to have the chance to decide what I wanted. They told me that if I wanted to give my family a chance, they would still let them live in that house. And if I wanted them to leave, that was what they would do. Apparently, even when they visited, no one in the family seemed happy to see them. And I was the only person who really seemed interested in having a relationship with them. My grandparents didn't want them to stay anymore. So I had to decide if one of my parents had a house or not, and to be honest, I think I want them to leave. But that would be too vindictive. I want to know if it would be the right thing to do or not. What would happen if I told my grandparents that I wanted to kick my family out? Update 1: Hi, before you, nothing. Thank you so much for all the comments and the support I have received since I made that post. It really means a lot to me. You have no idea how much I appreciate you guys influencing my decision. I have decided that I want my family to leave that house. I told my grandparents a couple of days ago, and now they are in the process of evicting my family. Of course, there are a lot of legal issues that I don't have to worry about according to my grandparents. And also, there is a lot of emotional manipulation that my parents and mainly Sasa have been trying to do. However, my grandparents are immune to that. After talking to me, they found out exactly what my mother had been saying about them and what she had taught her grandchildren. They now have a lot of sympathy towards them. And to be honest, Sasha and her boyfriend are hard-working people. I'm sure they can handle themselves, as can many others, people in the world, and the same applies to my parents, so I don't think I should feel bad about anything after all. It's not like they felt bad about me when they kicked me out, knowing that I was only 18 and still studying at that time. Despite everything, I was able to keep going academically. Although it happened just before my exams and my enrollment in college, I told my grandparents that they didn't have to worry about it, but they told me that they would take care of any student I had taken, and they apologized for not being there to help me. Before, we have a lot to talk about, and a lot to make up for. But for now, things are going pretty well. Update 2. Hi, a couple of weeks ago, my grandparents started the process of evicting my family, and they have until the end of next month to leave. My mother is not happy about this, and felt that it was her. I should inform you that she had sent me an email a couple of weeks ago, trying to get back in touch with me and resolve pending issues, probably just to prevent her parents from kicking her out of the house. The email she sent me recently was very different from the one I received before. This one was full of insults directed at me, and she basically wished she had never been born. She even said she wished she had been in a car accident with my father, and that they would both have disappeared in one fell swoop. So yeah, that's my mother to you guys. But I don't care anyway, because she's not my family anymore. She's nobody to me, being honest. The only family I have now are my grandparents, my best friend, and her parents, and a couple of relatives that my grandparents are introducing me to, since my mother cut them off a long time ago, because she didn't want anything to do with her family. Everything is in a very strange place right now, but I know that I'll get used to it. Update 3. Hi. The holidays just started. I've gone back to my old home. It feels strange being back here since my family moved a long time ago. I don't know what they've been doing, and I'm not interested either, but my grandparents have been here since they left and they've fixed up the place. Well, even my room feels like home again. We're going to host a Thanksgiving dinner for some family members and my best friend, and in a few days my parents will be over. I feel like my life is getting back on track again. I'm really so happy, and I just wish I could feel like this forever.